Hi, everyone. Today we've got a very, very interesting guest on the Africa Travel Podcast, Dr. Tempe Adams. Now, she's an Australian-born conservation ecologist, and she specializes in human-wildlife coexistence. She spent over a decade working across Africa. She's pioneered innovative strategies to reduce human-wildlife conflict, especially human-elephant conflict, and she combines cutting-edge technology with indigenous knowledge to create sustainable conservation solutions that benefit both wildlife and local communities. Her work has seen some really good international attention, making her a leading voice in conservation and coexistence efforts on the African continent. How did I do, Tempe, with my introduction?
Wow, so much
Yeah,
flattery. Thank you so much. Thank you. That's
well,
a very, very
this
kind,
is what
very
the
generous.
tells me when I say, tell me about Dr. Tempe Adams. This is what comes out.
Wow. Feels very generous, very generous. Thank you. It's lovely to be here today.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
Well,
very excited.
I've never heard the name Tempe before. Where does that come from?
Yes, I know. It is, yeah, it's an interesting, very unique one. I think I might be the only Tempe Adams in the world. So it's originally Greek,
Okay.
just sounding quite African. It's originally Greek, means a beautiful valley in Greece, apparently, but it's because of the Greek origins. There's actually Tempe places all over the world. So there's actually a military base in South Africa called Tempe. There's a suburb in Sydney called Tempe. So it's kind of a name everywhere. But I was
Yeah.
named after a friend who was a amazing woman and a beautiful watercolor painter in honor of her. Yeah, and
Amazing.
that's.
Yeah.
But I
We
often think, sorry, people often get it confused with Tembe. So I'll also answer to Tembe.
okay. Well, I'll call you Tempe. I thought it might have been Tempe or Tempa or something like that. But yeah, beautiful story behind the name. And you obviously don't come from these here parts. You're originally Australian. So how did you end up in Africa?
Gosh, yeah, that's a great question. Yes, I am Australian. I first came over to Botswana when I was 16 years old on a safari with my mum. And obviously that started something, it kind of, as everyone says, Africa can be a very addictive place to come to. And it obviously started the African bug there. And then I just naturally went into the field of conservation. That was always my interest. And I would always sort of everything I was searching for and the research I was reading, I would just be constantly coming back to Africa and focusing on work done there. So I did a gap year like a lot of kids do when they finish high school. And I ended up doing sort of around the world trip. And then I ended up in Kenya, on the coast in Kenya, volunteering at an elephant community and a community run elephant sanctuary. And I did a stint there and then went back to university and then just kind of did a few research internships again throughout my undergrad, but ending up in Africa. And I ended up getting an amazing internship with Save the Elephants under the guiding leadership of Dr. Ian Douglas Hamilton, who is incredibly iconic in the elephant world. And I interned for him towards the end of my undergrad career. And I think that kind of gave me a real taste for what proper on the ground conservation looked like, especially specifically elephant conservation. And I was hooked. So I thought, if this is what I can, if I can kind of be leading, continuing this work. And he was very encouraging. They were very supportive. Then I was like, I want to keep doing that. So it just kind of kept flowing on. And then I ended up getting, strangely, my major was marine science in Australia. Doesn't make much sense. But I got a scholarship to do a PhD and I thought, you know what, this is my chance. And within the Australian system, we do have a lot of freedom in our PhDs. Yeah, I thought, look, this is my chance. I'm going to try and get my PhD going in Botswana and human elephant conflict. That's kind of the area of speciality I went down that road.
Yeah. You kind of flew over a question I wanted to ask. Before you ended, what was the inspiration to get into veterinary? I knew a vet, I dated a vet about 25 years ago, and she told me that she became a vet not because she loves animals, but because she loves humans. And that was quite an interesting take. What was your inspiration in getting into veterinary?
So I didn't study veterinary. I studied environmental science and majored in biology. But I went down, it's interesting. So I've always been really drawn to problem solving. I like problem
Uh-huh.
solving, I like to be able to be jumping between different kind of disciplines.
Yeah.
And human wildlife conflict
Mm.
kind of fills that void. And I mean, it's a growing area of science. I think even when I first started working on it, I mean, that was 15, 16 years ago, it was a very new sort of avenue of science. And because it's very focused on people. I mean, it has to be focused on wildlife and people, but I've always been someone that loves chatting to people, hence why we're doing this sort of conversation. I really love communicating what message, fascinated with way you can communicate. So human wildlife conflict, that area of expertise just kind of ticked all the boxes. And I kind of really enjoyed the challenges that it presented. And I like science that is very solving real life problems, and debatably human wildlife conflict is one of the biggest conservation dilemmas the globe's facing. So I knew that there would be work in it, if that makes sense. So it was just kind of going with and going with what I was starting to really enjoy and what I was drawn to and what I was wanting to read more about. And I just kept seeing big gap in the research sort of world on specifically that very big topic.
You mentioned your association with Ian Douglas Hamilton and what an inspiration he was and how that's influenced you. I recently had a very interesting conversation with a gentleman called Kingsley Holgate, and he was telling me about his interactions with Dr. Ian Player, who kind of had this handing over of the guard really to a bunch of, a whole generation of conservationists here in South Africa and across Africa.
Yeah.
But he did also, so in the handing over of this baton, if you were, from Dr. Ian Player, he said that not enough had been done within his lifetime in the field of conservation, and that it needs to continue. How would you think, or did you ever get a message from Ian Douglas Hamilton about what he felt was sort of prevalent in his world and the world that he was leaving behind to a person like yourself and others?
I mean, I just think Ian is so incredibly passionate about elephants and elephant conservation, and that is incredibly contagious to be around. But I think what's really admirable about he himself and the elephants is that they have an amazing mentorship education program, and they are very much trying their best to recruit the next generation, because we always say the next generation is the future. Absolutely. And I think, his legacy is all of us. So it's amazing how many of us in the elephant conservation world right now did do an internship under Ian or someone at Save the Elephants at some time in their career, which is really astounding. So I think that is the true of what, his lifetime of work. And it is constant work. That's the thing. I mean, a lot of Ian's work formed the basis of what we know about elephant conservation, elephant behavior, elephant population estimates, all these sorts of things. And then, I mean, I think it's really incredible how focused they are on actually facilitating these internships and giving people a chance and a platform to get a taste for what that work might look like, to be guided, have the guidance of such incredible scientists that they have on their team. So you can get a real taste for it. But I think Ian was amazing in that he saw something in the passion that I had. And I remember it very clearly. He just said, "You've got to keep doing this." And we just come back from a very interesting long flight. He's quite a famous pilot in Kenya. And we just landed and it was such a thrill to be flying with Ian in northern Kenya. And we were just having a big conversation about, what's my future looking like? Where would I be interested in, where do I want to lead my life? And he just really said, I really, really think however you can, make sure you keep doing it, because you can see this, you're made for it, which it's hard to ignore when someone like Ian says something like
Yeah.
that to you. And, I mean, it definitely obviously landed and was very inspiring. But I do think, I mean, we're all a legacy of that, which is brilliant. Yeah.
I really want to get into your work, but I'm interested in something at the moment. Like you just said, since we've been talking, that you came to Africa and now you've been doing this work. I know that it's not that easy. So, what are some personal challenges that you've had adapting to life in Botswana? I mean, it's not, it's a beautiful place, but every place comes with its intricacies, and so how have you adapted to actually working in that environment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think I've ever really been asked that question before. It's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I made it sound very simple, but yes, as you have alluded to, it has been an interesting challenge. I think, I was lucky in that I started off my work here with my PhD. So I knew I had a very clear target and goal in mind when I came through it. And I was working with, which I think is really, really important at the time, I was working with a Botswana owned and based NGO. So I was very aware that I was an Australian and that was my identity coming in here. But the work, I thought and I think it is the case for a lot of international researchers coming in and working in these different countries, that you have a good, strong local institution that you're associated with to make sure that research that you're doing or whatever work you're doing going to have a long-term effect. I think it's imperative. So I was very lucky to have that clear association. But I think it's, in a lot of ways, Australia and Botswana are quite similar. It's really, I don't, environment wise, it's very comparable. So there's a lot of familiarity for me working here. I think I felt very comfortable in that regard in the environment. Obviously, the wildlife is quite different, but I do think it was really important for me when I came over was to just really sit and listen to what everyone was saying around me, read the local newspapers, consume everything around you and really take it in, rather than kind of inserting yourself and giving your opinion. I just really wanted to kind of get a good gauge of who are the different players, what's the conversation and the interesting topics that people keep bringing up. I think it was, I just being a fly on the wall was really important and not pushing any views on anyone. I think that was a really key thing for me. And that's what I encourage a lot of young researchers to do. Just sit and listen. I think it's really, really powerful. But I think, also just the pace of life. Things happen a lot slower here, I would say, realistically speaking, and when you organize to have a meeting with the chief and you set a time, often not that time, and often you'll have to wait a few hours or postpone to another day. I just think the pace of life and is very different, and you just have to adjust to it. And I think, you just have to probably just build on your patience a little bit. Yeah. But I think, honestly, I think it's harder for, maybe researchers coming from the Northern Hemisphere rather than Australians, because and then I think, I came from a farming family, multiple generations of farming family. I think that helped me hugely here as well, because farming is huge here and people are very passionate about it. So I think there was that level of relatability for me in that. Yeah.
Okay. And I mean, how long have you been in Botswana?
I'm coming on to my 14th year.
Okay. And how, if you had to have a conversation with yourself 14 years ago and say, it's going to be like this and not the way you thought it was going to be, what would you say?
Yeah, I don't know. That's also a great question. I mean, I would crack on. I'm now in the position I've had because of all the different challenges. And it's an adventure. You've got to just be open to it, adapt. I think that's the best African expression, make a plan. I think that's probably what I would tell myself. Just get ready to make a plan, because that is just the case. And the nature of, I think, working in conservation anywhere is a skill that you do develop quite quickly working in conservation, and especially in Africa, for sure.
Let's talk a little bit more about your work in depth now. Tell us about your daily job. What does that look like?
It's always changing, always different, depending on what we have going on at different times. I'm now in a different phase in that I'm now very focused on research. So I have my own research program now, and I'm working through the Okavango Research Institute, which is an offshoot of the University of Botswana, which is fabulous. I love getting kind of back into research. So a lot of my work is, of course, collecting data, of course, a lot of scientific writing, I supervise students, which I'm very passionate about now, and communicating science is huge for me. And then also supervising students and encouraging the next generation. So I do I'm now trying to facilitate more capacity building, more information skills and learning. So I have a joint position where I also with the Australian University, University of New South Wales. It's based in Sydney. And so it's a collaboration between the University of Botswana and the University of New South Wales, and just trying to build that collaboration between students, between the two. Yeah, so it's a real mixture of all sorts of things. And then I also will go and do lectures for different tourism groups. I'll do, a lot of talks left, right, and center, but that's sort of out at the moment. But I do really like writing the scientific publications, getting something published, but I think it's also really, really important to go, well, what are we meant to do with that information? And how can we make that get implemented in the right policies within the country, make sure the people that are actually involved in the research can understand it, those on the ground. So I think a lot of my work is not just writing the science, but actually how do we make sure that science gets used? So it's hard to give it a day because always quite different. Yeah.
In terms of, we know what human wildlife conflict is, but to someone who doesn't live in this world, in this part of the world, and doesn't spend their time thinking about the problems that you are solving, what is human wildlife conflict and why does it exist?
Human wildlife conflict in the most basic form is a negative interaction that happens between humans and wildlife. And it can take lots of forms. It can be, you're walking to work and you see a elephant in the road, and what do you do? And that's kind of a negative interaction that's happening, especially if you've not grown up in a place with elephants around. So then it's concerning and it's a challenge to your day. Oh. Or it can be, obviously I'm generally using elephant examples because that's my speciality. Or it's, you have your subsistence crop growing. This is kind of the most traditional form of conflict, or your traditional crop growing. An elephant can come in and potentially eat the whole crop in one night, and that's your livelihood for the year. So that's a very extreme sort of version of conflict. It can be down to roadkill, and you're driving along and you see a kudu on the road and there's an accident, and that you run into the kudu, you kill the animal, or you damage your car severely. Those are all kind of different scenarios of human wildlife conflict, and obviously it's a huge global issue, and it can be for tiny species right up to elephant-sized species. And I think working on elephants and elephant conflicts, it's obviously elephants are incredible iconic animals, and it is, I say unofficially, I think they're probably the most tattooed animal on people in the world, because they just sort of, I have to know the statistics on how many elephants attack people in the world. But it is, I think they're such an emotive animal, and people do often feel quite spiritually connected to them. They're obviously the animal a lot of people when they're on safari here want to see, but living with such an animal can be really, really challenging as well. Farming in an area with elephants, just as I said, walking to work in an area with elephants in it can be challenging. And it's about how do we deal with those challenges in the different forms that they, and then what are those solutions? Is basically what facilitating coexistence is. People are trying to step further and further away from using the term conflict because it's got quite obviously very negative associations, and it's more about let's be positive and move towards this association and context of coexistence. How do we work together to work in coexistence with them?
Yeah. I mean, to a lot of people, it would sound bizarre that there is even such an issue. In the minds of a lot of people, wild animals are supposed to be behind fences or behind sort of insecure areas. But in Botswana and a lot of other places in Africa, these places are not even fenced. So in my mind, and this is the issue that I always sort of grapple with. In sort of I wear a couple of hats, and the one is on the tourism side of Africa, and the other one is also on the conservation side of Africa. The global population is set to probably plateau at about 11.5 billion people. So we've still got some distance to go, and Africa is the continent that needs to catch up with the rest of the world. I mean, North America's population is declining, Europe's population is declining. Even China's population seems to be stagnant at the moment.
Yeah.
So Africa is the only place where this problem is going to get greater as time goes. How do we're trying to deal with the situation now that is not even as great as it's going to be in say another 7,500 years. How do we do that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a wonderful question, and that is the question I think we're always working towards. I think there's so many different factors here. I think yes, you can't say no to development, especially here in Africa. It's going to happen. Population is set to be increasing, as we're saying. It's mainly going to be increasing on this continent. So I think that's inevitable. And I think people also don't completely understand how, a lot of the wildlife that we have living here are big animals, big iconic animals that need a lot of space as well. So the fact that we have animals that need a lot of space, and then we also have the population projections, it's not a great forecast, basically, as you're saying. And it can be extreme. I think what is really important is to never say no to development. It's the reality. But I think what we can do now as science practitioners, as community leaders, it's actually all the different stakeholders involved, the tourism industry, it's about now, let's come up with long-term sustainable solutions, and let's combine all our knowledge, because everyone does have different knowledge about this issue, and combine that and make the mitigations and solutions as adaptable as possible with these projections that we have. So, ultimately, best solution allows wildlife to keep doing what they've always been doing, moving to the areas that they were always moving through traditionally, but also allowing the human population to, increase their agricultural development, increase their urban development, and increase the human population. But it doesn't have to be one or the other. I think sometimes we feel like it has to be that, but it doesn't actually. There are good long-term sustainable solutions that can be implemented, allow both things to happen. But it's about having the buy-in from the political leaders and the policymakers, and allowing that information to be accessible for them to make those calls and allow and facilitate that to happen. And I think that can be a big. But I also think, as you're saying, the different projections, a lot of now the work I'm looking at is comparing. So I do now work in Sri Lanka on human-elephant conflict. And I think when we turn to our cousins in Asia and what they're dealing with, we can learn really interesting key lessons. Let's learn from the mistakes they've made. Let's learn from the successes they've had, because that is ultimately, I see our future, where we're heading in Africa is they're almost 50 years down the rabbit, so much further down the timeline. So let's share that information. And I think Sri Lanka is somewhere where they have debatably the highest elephant conflict rates in the world. So it's a really collaboration to be able to be learning from them, and vice versa. But it's
give an example of how they're dealing with it in a more positive way, and how we could maybe bring that scenario over to countries in Africa.
I think that's the thing. I think full credit to them. They reached out to us and they were like, we want to know what's happening in Africa. We want to learn from you guys, and I think just even conversation is such an important starting point. I think sometimes a lot of scientists are like, we work in these little solo, we just work on our area and whether it's, Chobe district or, and we're so focused on not sharing and not getting, putting our information and work out there. But actually it's so valuable to do that. We actually, strangely, the Sri Lankan researchers connected, because when I was with Elephants Without Borders, I developed this technique called the solar strobe light fence or barrier. And it was a barrier, amazing piece of very, very simple, but it came about because farmers consistently told me when they have an elephant coming into their field, they switch their torch on and off in quick succession. So I thought, okay, this sounds like a strobing sort of effect. So what if we were to grow on that concept? So then what we did is we put solar powered strobe lights along the side of the crop or fence or field or garden that elephants commonly enter from. And we ran a 2-year trial, and it was incredibly successful. We were absolutely blown away by how well that technique worked. We published a paper on that, and 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 that's been continued to be used by Elephants Without Borders and actually different NGOs within Botswana and maybe across Africa, which is fabulous. Lanka heard about this. They read the publication. They contacted me and said, we're trialing something similar. That's amazing. We didn't think there was anyone else out there doing such a thing. So they invited me to come over to see what they're doing and to give advice or to, it's just so we could actually connect on it. And it's incredible. It's fundamentally the same concept, but theirs is a little bit bigger, a little bit more industrial. They use sort of big lights and they go all the way around people's gardens or households. But I'm now working with their team on the ground about writing up their own publication. So I think it's amazing how we shouldn't be working in these little the isolated little huts, and we should be sharing this sort of information because this has now created a much bigger collaboration. And when I chat to the farmers on the ground in Sri Lanka, they have often the same narratives as the farmers here in Botswana, and then often create more of a conversation and solutions. It's just having the conversations and sharing it is really, really helpful, I think. And, I came up with the idea of rotating position of lights or taking down the lights when the farmers aren't growing crops. And that's been having a really good impact, and so it's interesting. The main difference, I think, is obviously within Sri Lanka, there's just so many more people, the density of people in that country and far less elephants, actually. They've got estimated between 5,000 or 6,000 elephants, but on a small island, that is a substantial number. So I just think there's so much more space limited than what we have in Botswana. And that's the key difference. And actually, their conflict is more about food and resources, whereas our conflict in Botswana is more related to water and access to water.
Okay.
But again, interesting to just compare and learn from one another and support each other.
Yeah.
When they issues that pop up week to week, they can send me a message and say, have you ever come across this? Or do you know anyone that's come across this? And how would you guys, want to kind of help this issue? And vice versa. I think it's so helpful. So helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You bring up a topic that's been on my mind for a very long time too. And I've always thought that there's no lack of great ideas. There's no lack of effort. Funding is always scarce, but there seems to be enough of it. What seems to really be getting in the way of the cause, if you were, of conservation is a lack of cooperation between institute people and conservation regions and so on. And this is really always what it boils down to, isn't it? That this is where the issue lies.
100%. That is a huge, huge problem within conservation. People not talking to one another, people not sharing and supporting one another, which is crazy because we all have the same goal. But I think a big issue is unfortunately, I think the key player in the conflict world is the people on the ground experiencing the conflict. And often they are the left out of the conversation. So I always think, you could come up with the best mitigation tool in the world. And it could be, you could have written so many scientific publications to show it's so successful. You could have government buy-in saying, we'll put $5 million into putting this throughout the communities, which is all wonderful. But people need to remember that you have to work with the people on the ground, ask them. So if they don't want that mitigation, then it's going to be a failure. It doesn't matter if it's successful. You've got to have the buy-in and the partnership with those people and the trust with those people. And they have to feel like they're in the process. And that can often take time. And often, funding deadlines or cycles don't facilitate or allow that sort of time. Or they don't partner with but along, great relationship with the community. It is absolutely fundamental to any success of this work. If you have the on the ground buy-in and ownership and trust with the community and those people, then it's going to work. That's why I'm saying it's so important to have those local partners and ones that have good history with listening to those around. And because conflict's always changing, our problems are, and I think it's so important to listen to those changes, understand why they're changing, and I mean, the absolutely is working with the people on the front line. And I feel like often spoken about, but often sometimes it's not actually
You,
around.
you're referring to what is it called? Technical ethnical knowledge, right? Is that what the acronym is?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And that's where I think, yeah,
Is it?
it's fundamental. And that is also, in Sri Lanka, that's the same. The NGO I partner with there has got a big, big presence within these communities throughout the whole country. And the people working for the NGO are from those communities. And it's absolutely, it's key, absolutely key, especially if you are a foreign researcher trying to get anything done. It's fundamental. Yeah.
There's a lovely anecdote which I've repeated so many times in my life, but it's such a perfect opportunity. So I heard the story once about this gentleman from a European NGO. He arrives in somewhere in Zambia, and he's on the banks of the Zambezi, and he's just arrived in this area, and he's come in with this idea that a lot of people come into these scenarios and they've got a solution and they look for a problem. And he was saying he was surveying this beautiful field in this village. It was right on the banks of the Zambezi. And he says, all right, guys, I've got a fantastic idea. We're going to plant carrots here. So he gets the whole village behind him. They plow that field. They plant the carrots. They get irrigation in from the river. It's all going beautifully. And then just before harvest time, he gets up one morning and the hippos have come out of the water and they've eaten all the carrots. And he says to the local people, he goes, why didn't you tell me this was going to happen? And they said, because you didn't ask us. And that story is always a prime example of how these things can go horribly wrong. Yeah.
Absolutely. That is a perfect. That's exactly what I'm saying. So I think, when you want to know where the conflict hotspots are, when you want to know what are the main issues it's interesting when you actually start to have a proper conversation. I mean, I'm just talking for farmers here. Often elephants are the start of the conversation, but, it actually comes down because we always say there's layers to conflict, right? You've got the initial sort of layer of an elephant comes and eats my crop, but then you've got a deeper layer. Maybe that problem happens every single year and they don't feel like there's any buy-in from government or support from government. And then you've got the next layer, which is, maybe governments the policies are failing them. And then it breeds more resentment within that individual, not maybe necessarily towards, maybe it's more actually, it's presented as anger towards elephants, but actually it's a deep-seated problem with not feeling supported or heard. So I think really understanding the complexities of those layers of where the conflict's coming from is so important. And you do that by having proper conversations and listening. I think it's so important when any kind of conflict resolution work is done that you really have spent some time in that area with all the main people and had so many different conversations about what's going on before you even start anything.
Our conservation is not about animals, it's about people. Because at the end of the day, if we don't look after what we have, we are going to be on the short end of that.
100%. I mean, it's interesting. A lot of the work I previously did was very focused on elephants, right? And now it's so focused on people, because in order to implement, you do need to know, obviously, what the animals are doing. A lot of what I previously looked at is actually looking at how elephants are adapting to different forms of human development. So whether that's agricultural development or urban development. So we understand they're adapting to us. They're incredibly far, they're quick to learn.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Super intelligent. It's just so sad that, we need to pull up our end of the bargain, and we need to adapt as and be more flexible. And that's often where we're failing.
When I was listening to you speaking about Sri Lanka and their experience and your experience in Africa, the thought went through my mind that is there not perhaps a cultural aspect to their acceptance and their willingness to coexist with their wildlife that perhaps doesn't exist within our cultures here in Africa?
That is a great question. I thought that would be the case because the majority culture is a huge component to coexistence and how you facilitate that. But so the majority of the population in Sri Lanka is Buddhist. That's the predominant religion. And obviously there's a whole philosophy of, you don't injure or harm any animals. But fascinatingly, it's like a war zone in a lot of these farming areas. And one of the most common forms of sort of retaliation from conflict on the human side is putting explosive devices, watermelons, and blowing up whatever come into the field. And that, I think, is possibly, or even electrocuting it, getting power cables down, connecting it to the fence line, and actually electrocuting wildlife. So you can imagine there's the most horrific injury, if not fatalities. So in a way, I see it more, again, it's a lot more extreme there. So I was shocked, started reading into it and hearing about the stories that this NGO has been working with. And I haven't seen anything to that extreme, and definitely not in Botswana. I have heard of different cases throughout Africa about tensions getting higher and people getting more and more frustrated. But I mean, that's it's crazy. I mean, and that's not supposed to be sort of culturally done. But then a lot of these result in not killing the animal, but just actually injuring them. But culture plays a very important role. But I think just the stakes are so much higher there in some cases. So people become very desperate.
Yeah.
I think I was shocked when I went there to really understand the state of the conflict there, because it is extreme. But a lot of where it's interesting, Jeff, sorry, just to add to that, again, it's like digging through the layers. It's like, why? And they've got every kind of mitigation around their national parks. They're very fenced. They've got multiple, I've not been there, but they've got multiple fence lines. They've got trenches. They sort of throw everything at protected areas and keeping the wildlife there. But a lot of their issue is actual vegetation in these protected areas is not palatable for elephants anymore. It's overrun by invasive species, and elephants actually have to leave the park to survive. So that's why they're putting themselves in these horrific conflict situations, because they literally have to go through it to survive. So we don't have anything like that yet. I hope we don't get down to that sort of case. So I think it's once you understand really why the elephants are having to do what they're doing, then you can look at how to improve the habitat in the national parks. It's a much bigger question, bigger solution to look at.
Just for people who maybe don't know, how many elephants are we talking about here? I remember being in Huangi National Park a couple of years ago, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, there were about 30,000 elephants that sometimes occur in that region, and then they migrate. And I think Chobe's got something like 60,000 elephants. I mean, we're talking about quite a large number of...
So it's a great question. Everyone loves to know about elephant numbers. I feel like I get very fatigued by talking about elephant numbers, but I know everyone likes to know what the different numbers are. And every time you travel to a different area, people, how many are there of this or that? So Botswana's elephant population has been sitting pretty stable for the last 15, 20 years at around 130,000 elephants for the whole of Botswana.
Yeah.
Maybe, obviously, it always varies, but it sits around 30 to 40,000 for the whole district.
Okay.
But what's also really important is Botswana's elephants are not just Botswana's elephants. They're also Zimbabwe's elephants, Namibia's elephants, Zambia's elephants, Angola's elephants. It's a free-moving population, and you have the seasonal fluctuations. But when I'm coming up with that number, and that is based on numbers and aerial surveys that have been flown by the Department of Wildlife and by Elephants Without Borders and by private consultants. So, that's sort of... I actually just recently put together a figure looking at all the elephant numbers from all the reports since sort of the 1980s, when they first proper systematic survey system of aerial survey systems in Botswana. You can see the trend actually very clearly. I think where there's some confusion, especially when it comes to Botswana, is the range has changed. So the population isn't necessarily changing, but the range has changed. So we're seeing elephants further south than we've seen in recent years. And I think that's where the perception is, and the misinformation can be that the elephant numbers are increasing, but actually they're moving. Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah. So I think
right.
it's interesting. And then, a lot of the work now that in the last few years, started comparing the conflict experience in Chobe, which is a very, very known conflict hotspot in Africa, not just Botswana. And then working in an area where there's a new conflict hotspot, which is Central District. Suddenly they're seeing, that's in the center part of Botswana. Suddenly they're seeing elephants there within this, this people's lifetime. So we've also got to think about lifespan and their generation lifespan, and then our generation lifespan. It's always good to bear in mind.
Yeah. Fascinating.
So, it's important.
I have questions left. The one thing is that something that I'm involved in quite a lot is on the funding side. Nothing happens without money, right? How do you see, what's the potential for getting more funding into conservation in Africa? How do you see that? And I'll go a little bit into what I mean. So globally, only about 10% of the required amount for conservation of $700 billion is required annually globally. Only 10% actually trickles down. And when I heard that, I started off on a new tangent in my career to try and answer that question. Why do you think it is like that? And what can we do to solve that problem?
Goodness me, that's a great question. That's a crazy statistic. I've never heard of that. That is mind-blowing and really sad.
There's a McKinsey report. I can send you a link to it. That's
yeah. I mean, it's so it is very frustrating, and it does take money to come up with this, with this proper long-term solutions. I mean, I think there is more. In this day and age, there's more accountability about where funds go. There should be more accountability of where funds go. I mean, how we can direct more money into even, specifically Africa is really, really important. I don't quite necessarily have the solution to that. I would just encourage people to listen to a podcast like this, access more information. I do think, I think information is absolutely key, and where you're getting your information is really, really important, because I think it's good for people to question things, because we can nowadays, and we all have access to, all these different platforms. It's quite overwhelming. That's why I think I encourage people to be quite selective about their platforms, do their homework on it. I think that's really important. But I do think there needs to be more accountability in where funding is going, whether it be, I just encourage people not to be too misguided by beautiful brochures and posters and wonderful, very flashy presentations of where money and the impact, measuring impact. I think it's really good to dig deeper than that. And I think it's, again, really good to support organizations that do have a long history working in the country, do have a long history with very, a big network within that community. I think is absolutely key. Again, it can be hard to actually find that out, but dig deeper. And I encourage people to reach out, to these organizations and really try and have a conversation. I think there's nothing wrong with having a call rather than just go on a website. I think it's really, and I think sometimes we rely too much on written proposals and sort of selling it in such a way, but actually when you can actually have a human conversation, talk about what the challenges are, where they want the funds going, what are their major issues. I think that's really, and I see that happening very often, and I don't know why it's not happening, because I think, but I mean, there's a lot of reasons. I suppose humans are becoming less and less connected to one another. Ironically, in-person contact doesn't seem to be happening. Conversations don't happen anymore. We're all on our phones and our devices, which is scary. But I do think I always encourage people as well, if they have made big donations to different NGOs or partners, follow up on it. Really do find out where it's gone. It can have hard to impact sometimes, but again, have a call. I think sometimes when you send in reports, ask to do a presentation with that report. I think that's really, really key. And that's something area that I haven't seen happen just yet. And investing in getting the answers is really important, because you can see pretty clearly if money's been mismanaged, or if the sort of, I mean, my biggest thing is also look at not just the funding of implementing something, but actually the further monitoring, the long-term monitoring of the success is really important, which I always see.
Yeah.
And often that's harder to measure. A lot of it's very on people that are actually on the ground for that, rather than actually, we ran this many workshops, we've handed out this many chilies for whatever. That all sounds very impressive, but actually measuring the impact on that community is more important, I think.
Yeah. The good news is that I have quite a few good contacts in the banking world in Europe and North America, and there's a lot of conversation happening at a very high level about how do we make impact bonds or green bonds, or how do we monetize, how do we make conservation investable in a bond in order to take it to the greater market so that people can buy these bonds. And the difficulty that they're having, however, is that what we've picked up in our conversations is that there's a disconnect between that very high level macroeconomic thinking and the place where you're at, which is at grassroots level, on the ground and actually implementing. There seems to be a lack of research for the people that are looking for the answers at the very upper level of economies. They don't know how to actually access the projects, which sounds ridiculous for us at project level, because all we do damn day long is say, this is what we're trying to do. Can we have some money, please? And they're saying, well, they're not hearing, or they're not understanding exactly where the investable part is. And on a very practical level, like one of the companies that I have, we have clients who are conservation projects that are looking for funding. And a lot of the time, most of the time, every time, when we get introduced to the projects, when they approach us and they say, can we get some money, please? Can you help us? I say, give me your material. Give me the material that you have been using in order to get the funding. And it's as clear as day as to why they're not getting the funding. And because when you read a proposal from a conservationist perspective, now I'm generalizing, of course, but it is all about the need. It's all about, we need a fence because the elephants are being, there's this coexistence issue between them. So it's always a dire situation. And to an investor, that just looks like risk. They're looking at that scenario and they're going, well, where's the benefit? And I'm not talking about funding. I'm not talking about grants or anything like that. I'm talking about a private equity investor. And there are enough of them who are interested in this field. But when they read these proposals, it's never about what they're going to get. It's all about why they need their money, which is something, is sort of an issue that we've discovered that we're trying to solve.
That's
anyway.
You're absolutely. No, but it's true. I mean, I think we literally grant applications that says, what is your statement of need? Like we're so we're rehearsed in writing the same formula, doesn't work, but it doesn't work. But you're right. There is sort of a disconnect. Absolutely. And we do need that middle where it's almost like a facilitator or someone that can just communicate between. Yeah, I think it's absolutely fundamental. People are starting to see that needs to happen. But I also think, conservation and economics don't always go hand in hand with one another. And I think that's where we're evolving towards, that is what we're moving towards. And we're desperately needing to. I do feel like Africa's being left behind a little bit. I feel like a lot of other regions are kind of light years ahead of us in that regard. And I think we do need to catch up. The economists speak in a very different way than most people in the world. But I do think that, that difference is much bigger even between a conservation and economist. So you're right. I think that intermediate body and facilitator is absolutely to make it happen. It's almost like a translation,
Yes,
I think.
absolutely. Because it's two different angles.
Completely.
But I do have one last question, and it's the worst question anyone can ask you. It's the year 21.
Okay.
In the mind of Dr. Tempe Adams, what does the world look like?
Oh my word. I mean, in the ideal world I would love to just think that we still have some space where we have free roaming wildlife. I really do. And I think that's obviously a big part of why I live in Botswana, because we debatably have one of the largest free roaming wilderness areas still left, which is incredible. But I do think I really want to maintain that as best we can for everybody, for the world, to keep that going. But I want to see citizens thriving. I want to see intelligent development going on. I want to see people harvesting great, wonderful crops. I want to see Botswana not importing so much food from South Africa, but actually being able to feed themselves with great new farm initiatives. And because the potential is there, the want from the right people is there. The farmers want to learn how to improve farming skills. We have that information out there. It's just putting everything together. I think sometimes in conservation, it's very easy to see no light at the end of the tunnel.
No.
I think, and then but I think it's really important you always have to stay optimistic. And I think you always have to celebrate the wins that you have, because they might be just important steps in the right direction. So I'm optimistic. I think that is something that we can keep working towards. The world can keep working towards. Definitely. So yeah, I'm optimistic. Everything is going to be thriving in time, humans and wildlife.
If we have some more people like yourself, I'm sure it will be. Tempe, I could speak to you for days. So thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate it. And I hope a lot of people get to see this conversation. I'll do everything that I can to make it so. And it's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. It's been very fun. Very, very fun. I really look forward to putting this out to the world.
Yeah.